Yes. The home schedule is the first thing. Yep. Everyone is very nice and this meeting is very fun and we will always be there.
I mean, there's no way that I could, yeah.
Okay, I think we're pretty much ready. I just got your email.
Okay, yeah.
We have a couple prepared on our end as well,
You guys
but
go first.
yeah, ours will not take very long here. I don't have them emailed to you yet, since we're running behind. I will get them emailed to you as soon as possible here. Let's start with 25, because that's the one I pulled up first here. Share.
What are you starting with?
25, it's just the one I pulled out first here. 25 is one of the ones where I think it's technically on your side of the table, but we've talked back and forth about some of the different associated parts with it.
Yeah,
And I've mentioned, I think 1 or 2 times that we've been thinking about it. We had a couple of different ways of looking at it.
Mhm.
And I figured the easiest way for us to have this discussion was just, why don't we prep a counter proposal and kind of put out in paper what we've been talking about.
all right.
So you had indicated a willingness to kind of change the duration to be 3 years following ratification.
Mhm.
And so if we're gonna talk about something like that, this is kind of what we're looking at. What it would be, which is just kind of forcing that reopener at least a year before the contract would expire to give us good time to negotiate following that.
Okay.
So we would have a solid year before the contract would expire to do that, to do negotiations for the full book. Obviously, we hope future full book negotiations don't take near as long as they have this time, but
Right,
giving us a
agreed.
year is a nice round number. And then we had talked before in one of the other articles in the 20s, just making sure we have that healthcare reopener from Article 12
Right.
referenced, and just to not change any of the other articles, I was like, well, let's put it here to match the Article 10 reopener we have in here. So that language 25.4 matches what we already have in Article 12, just to make it so all the language kind of lines up across the contract.
You don't want it, you're not suggesting we have to take it out of that one, you just.
I don't-
match, right?
I think we just wanted to match because one of the other articles that mentions reopeners says it should only be reopened in as shown in like Articles 24 and 25.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to be like, well, we didn't mention the healthcare reopener in either of those articles, so we're not forced to reopen. And we did
Yeah.
negotiate that, so we want to make sure that's clear here.
Okay.
So yeah, that's about it. And the rest of the language should be the same as previous proposals and discussions we've had on
Yeah,
that.
I think that's all good, Austin. I would make one suggestion, and that is, I think we probably, and we can check on this.
Mhm.
I think it has to be date certain. I don't think we can refer to.
It has to be date certain.
I think it has to be date certain, and
Okay.
I would recommend that we have it be at a regular date of transition. Assuming we get all wrapped up. If you want to, we can maybe revisit this one as like the last thing we TA.
Mhm.
So that we know exactly kind of when that's likely to occur, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Part of it will be, I think there would be some difficulty. Because you're not gonna have your vote on the same day probably that we have
Yeah,
the board action, like, it can, I don't want there to be any, like, we can't leave it vague, like, it needs to be,
Yeah, it needs to be
this
exact.
is the date that the status quo period would start, like, that would be my recommendation, but I appreciate that you guys are willing to think about that. I think that this is all stuff that we've already sort of agreed to in principle and certainly discussed, so I mean, I think
Yeah.
we're really close.
yeah, and I think, yeah, if we want to leave it until we have that certain date, I think we're fine with that.
Okay.
But everything else in there should just be what we've discussed. So we'll move on to Article 24, which I'll share on Zoom, but this is again going to be a really 5-second one here.
Yeah.
Real quick, just for anyone who doesn't know, we're in these kind of ending articles, Article 25, which is the last one, and Article 24, which is this one. They're like legal contracty sort of articles. Yeah.
Could you make it slightly bigger on the screen, please?
Yeah, of course. This one it's going to be around a 5-second kind of discussion.
Okay.
we've gone back and forth on this quite a bit. I think you changed a little bit of language last time, but the only thing we've changed is you made it very clear this kind of subprovision A and B in 24.2.
Right.
You had them as separate sentences. We've just outlined them as separate subclauses to make it very clear those two different kind of circumstances there.
Okay.
That's it. That's the change, just to make it more clear for everyone as we're reading it now and in the future.
All right.
Okay, we're going to Article 4.
Article 4 is appointments, reappointments and terminations. I guess it's. It's where like LOAs, letters of offer, letters of appointment, like all of that kind of stuff lives.
Yeah, and this one we've massively modified over the last year and a half. And since we discussed it last time, I've basically, I went through and basically approved everything to make it very clear. We are just looking at this very last subclause. And I've highlighted the single change. We're not really interested in the changes that the and/or would make to that. We're
Okay.
really just interested in keeping it as an and. But that is the only modification we've made to this as it stands.
Okay. All right, so the rest of it's just read because it's within that context, but there's no other really changes.
There's no other changes there, no.
Okay.
It's just that change to your /or.
And we had that long discussion last
Yes, no,
time.
we certainly did.
Okay, and then we got one more for you here. Is Article 7.
Okay,
So this one is workload. This one works around how many hours people need to be working a week. And what they can do if they're overworking and things like that. This one we've also heavily modified over the course of the contract,
Okay.
but again, it is a single word. We talked about it. We were thinking about the changes between must and may
right.
in this section, and we're more interested in keeping it to may. So it's not kind of a mandated extra step that GAs are required to take throughout this process.
So, okay, I understand that. We've had a lot of discussion. Can you put that in the context of the grievance clock? Like, how do you all see that interacting with the grievance clock? Meaning, you know, giving rise to the action when the employee knew or should have known? Like, I'm, you see
Can
what
I-
I'm saying?
So I don't want to address the specific grievance part because I think I'm a little bit less clear on that.
Mhm.
But I think it's really important in in capturing this language as the second you are being overworked, you must do something.
Mhm.
I mean, literally, all of those conversations we had about removing average from 7.1
Mhm.
comes into effect.
Mhm.
Because if you overwork 1 week, like for people who aren't international, which we've been very clear, right? People who are international have that hard stop.
Right.
But for people who are not, like,
Sorry. Sorry, I was trying to open the proposed vote.
when does overwork start exactly is vague in the contract.
Right, no, my question is driven by, I mean, we've had so much conversation, we've gotten so close on this article, but one of the things that I want to be responsive and respectful of is the question that you all have asked repeatedly, understandably so. You know, when would you see yourself supporting a grievance about, that has been something we've spent a lot of time talking about. So, you know, one of the ways to sort of put the line in the sand, so to speak, would be by defining that date at which there has to be, if it's a filing of a grievance, understandably so, that's what they would do. But if it's, they may take steps, it would be difficult because it's vague. Again, I'm saying I have an answer. I just am looking for, how do you see this interacting? How do you see the interaction of when, you know, when the GA believes, the employee believes that they have been overworked? How does that interact with the timeline clock, the time clock that starts, you know, when they believe they've been subject to an adverse treatment or a violation of the contract?
I mean, another thing we've talked about in the course of workload is that you might be working over your contracted hours and never file for overwork.
Sure.
Because you might also never, in your words, right, like believe that you are being overworked.
Mhm.
And so if you have that must in there in that context as well, if someone is technically working over their contracted hours or it's gray area or they're an RA or like all of these different scenarios we've talked about, if it's a must, now somehow like they're breaking the contract for not doing anything to relieve them?
I guess our point is we don't think they should be able to opt in. Like, we don't think that there should be an allowance for them to like. So I guess that's one of the things that we didn't necessarily agree on.
How, when in this process do you think, if it's a must,
Mhm.
like what are you imagining GAs do?
What do you mean?
Like, say I'm a TA
Mhm.
and I've worked 25 hours for the last 2 weeks, but it's only 4 weeks into the semester.
Right.
Do I file for overwork if I feel like I'm being overworked?
I think you can have a bunch of things that are available to you. I think there's steps you can take. I mean, one of them would be to talk to the person who oversees your teaching and say, look, you signed me up for this section. It's taking me this long to do it. What is the expectation? Because it's taking me a lot longer than I'd expected. They could file a grievance. Again, I'm not saying we can't agree to the language. I'm just trying to make sure I have an understanding of what the intent is. Because what I would not want to happen with the May is we wind up with, and this is one of the other things we talked about, okay, so somebody, they don't contact you, they don't file a grievance, it starts happening in January, and now it's May.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, in the context of a grievance, the grievant has an obligation to file a grievance within a time frame of when they knew or should have known that we did something to violate the contract. It doesn't go on necessarily in perpetuity. There's a time limit.
Okay,
So again, I'm not saying they couldn't still file. We would still have to rectify the fact that in that case, the contract was being violated, but it could hamper or impinge upon the remedy that was available to the employee if we find out it's been going on for this long extended period of time. And because this was such an important component of getting this right, that's why I'm bringing it up.
what is the time frame? Do you know off the top of your
I think
head?
it's
It's like-
60 days, depending
I
on,
think it
it's
depends.
different for discipline, but Harold, I can open it.
Thank you.
Oh, you got it right there. Fine.
Yeah.
I left mine on there.
You guys have opinions?
Austin.
Well, I
Does it
think,
say 411 or 418 on the date on the top of that?
This does say 411, but we did not have it ready by last week, so it is
Yeah.
for 418, yeah.
I
Okay.
created it last week.
Yeah.
Make sure I had the right one.
I think that the wording of average, which I think is something that Hannah was bringing up, makes the timeline issue difficult to resolve, right? Because when, like, if we just had, at any point, if you work more than 20 hours of your contracted hours, that is grounds for being overworked, then the issue with like the timeline, I could see it better, but in this case, if it's average, it's average. When are you calculating the average? Is it like within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? There's no guidelines for that, as far as I know.
No, you're right.
And the thing that is making us push for like this change is the fact that we're worried that the must would be used against the GA filing the grievance, because there's no clear guidance for what is considered, sorry, I don't have the word, the steps, appropriate steps. Is it us deciding what are appropriate steps? Is it you? What if the person took appropriate steps by bringing it up to their advisor, for instance, in a meeting behind closed doors, there's no evidence for it. Their advisor doesn't remember that, that conversation, and all of a sudden we have a case of overwork that doesn't side with the GA because they don't have this, they don't meet this like very specific clause that I don't think would be working in the way that it was intended to be working, if that makes sense.
No, I got it. No, I understand. Yeah, I think we get it.
You all have also talked before about like the need to like weigh evidence. And so I feel like May still fits within that.
Yeah, there's two different things going on. I mean, we have a mutual responsibility to abide by 7.1. It's not just the university's responsibility, it's not just the union's responsibility, like we need to abide by 7.1. To the extent that we can identify provisions and mechanisms to serve us to do that, I think those were mutually beneficial, you know, those serve both of us. They shouldn't just serve one of us. So I understand Eva's point. I mean, I get it. Okay. All right, we can have a talk about that one.
And that's what we have for you today.
Okay.
And I think that's everything on our side of the table, so.
Okay, so we can probably do a couple of these real quick. Let's start with 19, if you don't mind, Austin.
Yep.
This is, I had mentioned this to you guys last time. This is something that you guys, I'd already sent it to you in DocuSign and you guys had signed off on.
Yeah.
And I had said, look, because you guys, I was willing to sort of sign it, but I think there was a mistake and I just want to try to rectify that before we both sign it and send it for ratification. And that is in line 26 and 27, we no longer have access to this information. So there's no way for us to report it to you. So previously, when we were collecting the dues deduction forms, we had this information that we could give it to you. We no longer have it, so we would be technically violating the report by not giving the information, but since we legally don't have it anymore, there's no way for us to do that. That's it.
Yep, that makes sense.
All right. So I've got, we can move on to the other three, but I do have a couple statements I want to read first before we get into them.
Okay.
I don't think a lot of what I'm going to say is surprising, but to your point, Austin, you said, look, last time we need to have this conversation. Okay, so let's have the conversation. So the first point that I want to make is that the university reasserts its rejection of interpreting GAU retreating from extreme positions as the equivalent of making concessions. We are bargaining from where the contract is, not where ideally you would like it to be. The second component is, you know, we reject the assertion that members should be paid for hours spent taking traditional classes and or when off appointment. You know, we've talked a lot about how to interpret the pay and, you know, the yardstick that you all want to use and have cited repeatedly, although you have come off of the initial position when we started, was that you want to use the MIT living wage calculator, which is actually given in an hourly amount, not an annual one. And then you use that to arrive at a number that you have you've presented multiple times. That is not, continues to not be the yardstick by which we are going to provide our proposals. You know, Article 7 of the contract is very specific about how many hours you are to work, as we were just discussing. You know, you brought multiple members, which we've listened to, that's said they spend far more than 20 hours engaged in educational activities every week. But we were probably most moved by the testimony that came from one of your members who acknowledged that his particular GA appointment had no upward effect on the hours he spends engaging with his PhD program. And in fact, without his GA appointment, he would still be putting in the exact same amount of time in his lab doing his research. The last best final offer, which we previously presented on stipends, represents, according to our records, the single biggest raise that GAU would have ever negotiated, even more than last round's increase, which at that time was the biggest increase previously negotiated. So when we go over Article 10, that's what you're going to see. The next point that I'd like to make is that we reassert our rejection of proposals that create additional definitions for or interpretations of discrimination that deviate from those asserted in our regulations and policies. Next, I'd like to point out that the university has made serious and significant concessions over the course of these negotiations, including expanding out-of-network health coverage and decreasing dependent contribution rates to the exact specifications as proposed by GAU. Rather than interpreting these concessions as a concession, which they were, it seems as if they were treated not only as an entitlement, but then they were tried to argue that they were in some way a concession back to the university. We're close to an entire new article at your request regarding regulations. There have been no such similar concessions made by GAU on any article whatsoever to our interpretation. GAU appears convinced that the university is uniquely expected to give concessions against the current contract language, when in point of fact, we've only really asked for one major concession since the beginning of the negotiations began, which is the removal of release time. We interpret concessions as changes to the status quo or the current contract, not from your opening positions, especially when that position represents such a marked and significant deviation from the current contract language. Finally, I was clear several weeks ago when at the table I said, I do not want you to misunderstand me. If you suddenly start making moves on language away from your more extreme positions that you've held for multiple months, that will not have any effect on the financial offer. I said that very clearly in March. I said it then, and I mean it now. Furthermore, if you honestly think that after spending so many months and months and months so far apart on the stipend issue, that I would be holding back additional financial authority just to try to leverage you on language is just unfounded. It may deviate from what your expectation was, that we were in some way, shape, or form holding out on what our less fast final offer is. I've tried to say it multiple times. That's not the case. Our best is on the table. Our best is on the table. So we stand by our less fast and final offer on Article 10, with the exception that we put back in the language, and this is what I mentioned a couple weeks ago, that we don't really like, but is current contract language with respect to the fees and the other stuff, even though in previous offers, we had actually recommended taking that out. The last thing, which is gonna seem like a small part, is I do want to acknowledge that we have spent accomplishing a lot of really good work in that we have made significant, dozens of changes to the contract, but we have been at this since September of 2023. And, we would really like to do what we have to do to bring it to a close. I will give you paper copies of everything here. Happy to talk about them. Boo.
I mean, I agree with that.
It's working.
Just one.
Right. Yeah, good.
I think there's two versions of 16. There's one that's clean and then there's one that's crossed out, just for
Okay.
clarity.
You've all looked that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a second version.
Got it.
Yeah.
And 16. Start.
Can I say something with
Please.
respect to a point that you made,
Sure.
during that speech? You have said this before, and you said it now, that, you don't think that GAU has been, that you're not like recognizing the moves that GAU is making. That you think that our, positions are extreme and made up out of thin air and hold no weight, and therefore us making any move away from these extreme positions, it's not really making a move.
I didn't
But-
say they had no weight. I didn't say you made them up out of thin air. I said they are not the current contract language and we're not gonna treat them like they are.
Okay, the point I think that you're trying to say is that and you've said that, GAU has made no substantial, what is it, concession, I think,
Mhm.
where, and it's making so many demands, and UF is so nice that the only demand to current contract language that you demand or request, whatever you wanna call it, that you're making is on Article 16. But I want to point out that by that logic, GAU cannot make any real concessions as long as we don't simply keep the current contract or worsen the current contract. By that logic, you're putting us in a position, and you're saying that we're in a position where the needs of graduate assistants, they are not real, they hold no weight, and are in some imaginary extreme far land,
It's not what I said.
and UF should not even consider
I also didn't say
moving
that.
away from that towards the center as
not what I
like
said at
any
all.
concession whatsoever.
That's not what I said at all. You're completely
Okay.
mischaracterizing me.
Okay, I
What I
feel,
said is, it is not. And we are not going to interpret you moving from an opening anchor that's extreme as the same thing as if you make a concession from current contract.
As you define as extreme, as redefined as the living wage for what GAs deserve across the university.
I mean, it's mathematically significant. Do you want me to? I can
It's
use-
mathematically significant
Yeah.
because we haven't gotten raises over the last several years. In 2017, we were making 95% of the living wage across the county, and now we're making 60%. It's extreme because the University of Florida for years and years has not given GAs raises that match the inflation in the local area. It is a large increase from where we are currently at. I'm not going to deny that. It is.
Okay,
It's what GAs deserve. Every year that we get raises that are pitiful, then we're going to go further and further away from that. Next year, when we reopen bargaining again, or we reopen Article 10, as we have the right to do every year, we're going to see that it's probably going to be even a larger gap, because that's where we're going to start, is at that living wage. So until we start making progress towards paying GAs a living wage, we're not gonna, you're always gonna view it as extreme, and we're always gonna disagree with that.
living wage based on what, Austin?
Off
Living
of-
wage based on what?
Off of the MIT living calculator, which you
how
said is
much
an
it
hourly
costs to
rate,
live in
unless you,
Gainesville.
yeah, which,
Okay, so, but you have taken the hourly rate.
no, because if you scroll down on the page, it gives you an annual rate.
Okay, predicated on working how much?
For working full-time,
Working full-time?
yes, which for international GAs is 20 hours a week.
No, that's how much they're legally allowed to work.
Exactly, so
That's how
they
much they're
have to be
legally-
able to
that is
live
not
in
the
this
same thing as
county on
working
20 hours a week.
But
They
that's
cannot
not the
live on
same
it, they
thing as
can't say,
working
oh, well, you can,
full-time.
we can't say, oh, you're gonna be able to live in this county if we paid you twice as much. That's what we're saying. You're
No,
making
that's what we're
half as much as you need to make to live in this county. That's what GAs are paid, all right?
Yes.
And you're saying that should be enough for you to live in this county. You're making half as much. Isn't that enough?
That's not what the contract says. This is exactly how much you need. That's not what the contract says, that's not what it says.
Okay,
There is certainly a legal governor on how much international GAs are able to make.
yes,
We've acknowledged that.
yes.
But to draw an equal sign between that and an interpretation of a full-time living wage is preposterous.
Okay, we
Our-
can
yeah.
just tell our landlords that we only work 20 hours a week, so we should only have to pay
Yeah,
half as much. I
our-
think that's fine, you know? If, you know, since we're only working so much a month, we should only have to pay half on everything. That's how
Yeah.
that works, right?
Yeah.
That's how that logic works, because you only have to pay us half as much, because they're legally bound by an upper limit. That's how we should do that?
So we should pay you twice as much for working less than half as much.
I think you should pay GAs twice as much because they're being overburdened and they're necessary for the success of this university. And I think GAs deserve to be able to pay rent and eat and, you know, not have to worry every day about how they're gonna pay their bills.
I'll
I'm-
also
it-
say our position, the logic of our position is that we believe that our employers should care that their employees can live, that has to make sure that their employees can actually live where they work. That they should be able to not starve, to not face, you know, medical bills that they cannot pay or, having to drop out, or, you know, eviction maybe. That your employer should care enough about their employees to make sure that they can make at least the bare minimum that they need in order to afford living. Because they need to live to work, right? That's a precondition of working,
But you're
as to be
not
alive.
full-time employees. You can keep asserting that the obligation is ours because you don't work full-time. That doesn't make it true.
That doesn't make what true.
You don't work, the contract, the 9-month 0.50 person
Mhm.
works approximately 720 hours a year by contract. A normal person working a normal job in the United States, in Florida, in Alachua County, works 2,080 hours. So to say, looking at the 2,080 person and draw an equal sign and then say, well, this is how much it is, so we're just gonna divide that same amount by 720, and this is what you gotta give us. I'm sorry, it's not logic that we're gonna follow.
You do have employees that are not working full-time that are making at MIT living standards or above. So it is a logic that UF does abide by sometimes, just not for graduate assistants,
Not as a contractual guaranteed definition minimum.
okay? We're trying to change.
What separates GAs from the rest of those, jobs that are paid, more than the living wage?
Are you suggesting we should pay everybody in GAU the same amount?
Well,
Because there is a huge range of how much we pay people in the bargaining unit.
exactly, and we tried to limit that range in our last proposal, and you rejected that as well. We believe the GA should be paid a living amount, and we believe the GA should be paid a fair amount for what the cost of rent is in the university. Or across the county.
I mean, the math is the math using the same tool.
Your logic is fine. It's mathematical and you're coming at it from this employer standpoint.
Mhm.
That does not change or negate the fact that there is a living wage in Gainesville.
Right.
Right. Okay, that is what we are talking about. We are talking about a living wage that you need to live as a person.
Yes,
We're not doing some sort of mathematical calculation to say that we're only 40% of a person,
right.
that we're only working 40% of a full-time employee.
Mhm.
We also have a bunch of people who are working 12 months out of the year,
Right.
right? And it's, our last few, we started at a living wage.
Mhm.
We started at the living wage.
Right.
And our last few offers have not even been at the living wage. So the argument that us pushing for a living wage is still out of the complete thin air or impossible based on the mathematical calculations doesn't even, like, the rubber doesn't even hit the road, because that's not even what we've been asking for recently. We've been asking for amounts that have been set by the university to live here as a student.
Right.
Yeah. Which don't even match up with a living wage. That's our delusion, right? Is to live at a wage that would sustain us for 12 months out of the year.
So, yeah, I get your point, Hannah. Here's the difference. The difference is, for whatever reason, whether it's being an international GA or the fact that the contract limits you to work 0.50, even at 12 months a year, we do not believe very strongly, and I've attempted to say this in a bunch of different ways, that the fact that you have a limitation on the amount you can work, whether it's a nature of being a student, whether you can't because of your visa status or international status, that responsibility of making up the half or more of the hours that you do not work in a given year does not ascribe to the employer. You are, in addition to being a GA, a student. You are not a full-time employee probably anywhere. So to say that, look, you're living in Alachua County, so you have a standard of living that's necessary for you to exist, which I'm not debating that in the least. But because for this 5 or 6 year period, you're not able to work full time, your employer you do have is going to take that into account and just pay you whatever you need. And then you're going to take a huge pay cut when you go get a full-time job, because now your employer can say, well, now that you're working full-time, I can dramatically decrease your hourly rate. It just,
Isn't
it
the
doesn't make
purpose of
sense.
a stipend, because we're also receiving a stipend. This is not a salary.
Right.
It's not an hourly wage. Is the purpose of a stipend not to be able to live in the place that you are working? Isn't that the whole point of a stipend?
It is money that we contribute to our employees in exchange for work done. Yes, I mean, that's what it is, but I don't think there's anywhere that says in here that it's gonna be of a certain minimum. That's why we bargain it. It also doesn't take into account the cost of the health insurance. It doesn't take into account the cost of the tuition waiver. Like, none of that is in the calculation either, because I recognize there's no point in bringing that up, because that's not money that you get in your check that you can then cash and buy anything with, other than what it is predetermined to be. But in terms of value, in terms of actual money spent, like, drawing the equivalent to the living wage component in Alachua County, it just doesn't wash with us.
How does UF create the minimum proposal? Well, like, what do you base it on?
It's based on a whole bunch of different factors. It's based on budgetary factors, what we think is reasonable and fair. We do comparisons with all other types of different organizations within the state and outside the state. I mean, there's all kinds of factors that it's not any one thing.
Okay, so in terms of budget, you wouldn't be able to afford the proposals?
You know, you've been trying to get me to say that for ever since the session started, and I'm not gonna say it, because I've never said that. I've never said it, and you're not gonna get me to say it now.
Yeah, because UF has the money.
And I've said that, I've said it in those
Yes.
terms. We are not willing to spend any more money. I've said it.
In terms of what is fair,
Do you want me to say it again? We're not willing to spend any more money.
okay.
Can we at least know what goes into, like, the black box of the offer?
I think I just tried to explain it.
Good, don't spend any more money. Relieve our fees. That's an extra paycheck, that's an extra paycheck a year we get. Relieve our fees, don't spend any more money, relieve our fees.
All right,
Let's be students, let's do the work we do, and at least relieve our fees then.
should we go on to the next article,
Sure.
or do we want to keep talking about it?
I think, we should sort of move on. I think we should kind of segue into Article 16 here. I think it's
Sure.
it's a great, and I think this is where we go back to that point about,
Ooh, really quickly, can
Yeah,
I
of course.
clarify?
Yeah.
In your previous last best final offers?
Yeah.
Had you removed fee relief? That's what you just said, and you put it back this
No,
time?
no. What I'm saying is that you guys had given us an offer where you removed a bunch of language, which in previous offers, we had suggested getting rid of in exchange for cash. Because
Okay.
we don't like fee relief. We had wanted to give you the monetary equivalent in
Right.
exchange for that. Rather than just handing you back your offer and crossing out what we didn't like, we also put back in the stuff that we don't like so that it's current contract language.
Okay,
So it's like, instead of just saying, well, we don't like this, but we'll accept, it would have been very disingenuous for me to say, well, we'll accept the fact that you deleted this because you were only deleting that in exchange for other things you put on there. That's what I was saying. And I said it last time, I'm like, you're gonna make me reassert language that we're not in favor of,
mhm,
but because we're reasserting it as CCL, like, we're not proposing to do it because we don't like it necessarily, but
mhm.
it's gonna be in the proposal, which is kind of unusual. That was what I was trying to say last.
yeah, so follow up on that. Is there anything different in this proposal than what you gave us in September, 6 months ago?
Not markedly.
Okay. That's a waste of time then. Let's move on to Article 16. Let's move on as well to this sort of assertion that the GAU has not made any sort of concessions over the course of the last year and a half, or market concessions, whatever language you chose to use there,
Sure.
which, you know, is demonstrably false, I think at a base level.
Okay.
I think if you are arguing from the point of view that we have asked for changes to the contract during a negotiation period, I think to say that we haven't made concessions is, you know, quite different than what we've done. Obviously, our starting points of Article 4 and 7 were radically different than what we are close to TAing on.
Mhm.
I mean, where we started at in Article 10 is radically different than where we are at currently. We have made massive changes and concessions to find a point where we're TAing. Our goal on this side of the table is not to give you a number that you're happy with. Our goal at the side of the table is to talk with an equal side, our employer, and find a number that both sides can agree with. We're not trying to make you happy. You're not trying to make us happy. We're trying to find that middle ground where both of us are the least unhappy as possible.
Right.
And so when it comes to Article 16, when it comes to the continued striking out of the entire release time provision, which is vital for the university and GAU to be able to have good relations and continue working as we have been, I think it's insane to say this is the only thing that you've asked for over the course of time. I think that's just not true in the slightest.
Okay.
Release time is vital. I think it helps both sides. I know it helps both sides. It saved GAs from, you know, having to leave the university when they're between a couple of positions. It gives GAs extra funding over the summer if they're a 9-month GA. It helps the university and GAU, you know, to fill out paperwork, to make sure that we're doing everything right. And to just remove it, to not give us a solid reason as to why you're removing it, except for the point that you're no longer interested, which I know you're no longer interested. You know, that's not something we're going to be like, oh, that's the only concession they wanted. That's just not true. And so, I mean, we're not going to find progress in Article 16. That's just how it's going to be. That's how I'm viewing it right now.
Fine.
I'll say, I personally consider this an extreme position from University of Florida to want to get rid of, release time positions is an extreme position.
Fine.
We have had it as current contract language, it's CCL, it has been CCL for years.
True.
And on top of that, it is an active attempt to destroy Graduate Assistants United and the labor union representing the needs and the well-being of graduate assistants.
Not true.
Not true. You would be removing the positions that allow for Graduate Assistants United to have at least one person in the office to read the emails of graduate students who don't understand the contract, who don't know if they are being overworked or if they are being underpaid because they didn't maybe get the raise that they heard everyone else is getting, or that they're having issues because their PI is harassing them. All of that, you want to remove our ability to have someone, at least one person, do that and help graduate assistants.
Nothing prevents you from doing any of that.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
No. you
Yeah, the
just-
fact
no,
that we
you-
have a job too.
You just don't wanna pay for it. The union wants to exist. They just want the employer to pay for your union to operate and exist.
Do you know what our budget is?
I don't care what your budget is. It's not my business.
Okay.
I mean, it's not my business to know your budget. That's not my responsibility.
UFN has release time positions. In fact, they have release time positions that, you know, do a lot more than what our release time positions have been doing. They are the people that keep bargaining going, the emails going. They are the people that just help us have a union.
You have every right to have a union. You have a certification. You have a certification.
You're just making it harder. You're making it harder on purpose.
We're just saying we don't want to pay for it.
Yeah, you're making it harder. And I feel like all of the graduate assistants here should understand that this is an active attempt from University of Florida to cut off leadership of Graduate Assistants United and therefore harm graduate assistants.
That's your interpretation.
Yes, it is my interpretation. It is my interpretation. It is the interpretation of leadership. It is the interpretation of graduate assistants.
That's fine.
Let's move on to Article 13.
Okay.
This is our non-discrimination article for those of you playing at home. Let me open it up real quick.
I think I may have missed the title may be wrong. I'm not looking at the wrong one. Why does mine have this title? Now look at yours. See how mine says this?
Yeah,
No, that's going to be.
Let me look at this one.
yeah, I might have put that over there thinking it was an extra.
Oh, okay, maybe this must be an. Okay.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, this one does show some changes
Yeah.
from the last position, which would make a first for today, so.
So we tried to, and again, this is one that has had so many changes to it. I would invite you to please look at it side by side with your last version. We've attempted to demonstrate clearly where the changes are. If there is something that is not changed, which is not identified, please point it out to us, because that was not intentional. We tried to make it very clear what our changes were. So in terms of you previously proposal in A, we've stricken that in its entirety. B, the critical component, I know we've gone kind of back and forth on this one, is what starts in line 11. We've taken mostly the first sentence, but the second sentence, if there's a conflict within these policies and the agreement, then the agreement shall govern unless otherwise superseded by state or federal law. That sentence we didn't take, as well as the sentence that is down in lines 27, 20, and 29, which is pretty much the same sentence there, while accepting the statement about sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. And then rejecting the line in lines 83 through 84 and 13.6.
You guys have any questions on Article 13? No.
Why do you continue to strike through a definition of discrimination? Is this the argument that it's somewhere else? Is that what you've said
It's not
before?
just somewhere else. It is the fact that we don't want to have separate definitions of what this is for all of our different bargaining groups.
Except that's the point of bargaining and having separate contracts, is to have different language for different protections and different things.
It's possible, but not about things that are governed at both the federal and state level necessarily.
I know this is a hypothetical, and we don't like hypotheticals, but if we found some sort of definition of discrimination at UF right now, and we stuck it in there, is that something you also wouldn't be interested in, or is it just that we've crafted a definition?
No, it's the fact, like I said, we're willing to point back to the policy and the regulation. What we don't want to have is separate versions of these, which it can create all types of legal confusion when you can file one problem, we have one discrimination case that's moving forward under a regulation or a policy, and then we have a different one, which quite frankly, in the grand scheme of things, to try to file a grievance about discrimination is so much less impactful than actually filing a true federal complaint or allegation about discrimination. I'm not really sure why, if anybody really felt like they were being discriminated against, they would file a grievance, which doesn't even have the remedial capacity to provide the remedy that you could if it was actually filed with like the EEOC. But it's in here, and I'm not gonna suggest taking it out in its entirety, but I do want to acknowledge the fact that there is a standard, but we want it to be consistent across the different groups, rather than trying to say, well, this is what discrimination means with this group of employees, but this is what discrimination means with this group of employees, and this is what discrimination means in this group of employees. We have a vested legal interest in making them as aligned as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's part of our, we understand the position of the University of Florida on that. Part of the thing here is pointing directly to that regulation and policy without putting those policies in here as they do it, gives the contract no weight there. Those policies and regulations, we have no control over. Those can change to whatever the university is told to do by the state or federal level, and we just get a weaker contract off the back of it. We would rather have something in here that gives us a solid definition for the length of this contract.
Except that's one of the things that's implicated by the fact that we've been discussing the regulation policy. If there's some sort of impact, then we would actually deal with it in the interim.
Would it have, okay, my question, so if we were to accept the discrimination is defined by university regulation and policy, and the university regulation and policy changes,
Mm-hmm.
we,
Do we get to impact?
do we get to impact? Because it is, like, the specific wording of the university regulation and policy is nowhere in this contract. Therefore, if you were to change university regulation and policy, this article would still apply. We wouldn't I could see you telling us that there's no case for impact bargaining.
Outside of what we've discussed and contemplated about regulations, but we've already talked about, I mean, we're really, I don't know, we haven't signed that one yet, but we're really close on that one, which that would come into play. It could come into play depending on the situation.
It could come into play, but if we were
There's a
to have
continuum
this
of things that could happen. It could be relevant, it could not be relevant.
I think with the language as it stands, if we were to agree to this, we would be handing over the definition of discrimination to the University of Florida and whoever guides them to decide what that means. And that's not something we're comfortable with. We would want to have a definition in here that lasts the length of this contract. And that's what we've attempted to do a couple of times now. Even if it matches what the current regulation and policy is, having it in the contract verbatim is something we'd be happier with.
Copying and pasting the university regulation directly into the contract.
Yeah, or some shortened version of it that follows the same path. So we have those protections in there and we know that we have those protections for the next 3 years.
And it's clear for if someone opens this up because they think I'm being discriminated against, what does my contract say? For clarity, having some sort of definition is helpful.
This just seems like you can change the definition at any point and it would be okay, even with, even with the other article. That says that, if you change some regulation that affects our contract, that we would have to impact bargaining, but. It's not clear if technically it would, that those changes would impact this contract because. The wording can be applied regardless.
Well, it would have to be a substantive impact. Based on the language that we're talking about for the 28th.
Yeah. I think we'll go back and discuss. I think we can see what's going on. Obviously, we're still a bit away apart on 13 as it stands. Yeah, I mean, I think one last thing here, I mean, is we've obviously been bargaining since September 2023. The contract is, been running over and over for as long as possible. And you came today and you said, we want to get to ratification. We want to get this done. And that's not your exact words, but the intent. And you know, Article 13 aside, I think focusing on these other ones is. I'm seeing no evidence of that. We're seeing no movement on these things. We're not seeing any, and I'm not even saying we need. Movement, you know, to bend to our position. I'm saying that GAU has bent time and time again to try to get a contract ratified. And this is getting us no closer to that end goal. This is not taking any location where we can get close to. A ratification for 10, for 16. So it's just. I mean, it's ridiculous is what it is. And I wish I had a better term than ridiculous to use, but.
That's fine. I mean, I just I can't believe that you all really believe that after months and months and months, you really think we would be sitting back and holding back on Article 10 after how many months of doing this? You really think you don't have the best possible version of that article that I could possibly put across the table to you? You really still believe that? And I find that interesting.
I mean, I don't know what we're supposed to believe, considering this is the first time we've gotten a proposal on stipends in over 6 months. And it's what, like the fourth we've gotten overall? I mean,
We gave it to you.
that's the same.
It's the
Yeah,
same.
it's the same. You know, you say you give us an offer, you know, and then don't do anything for 6 months, you know, when we're so far apart. Is not saying I'm hopeful to find a ratification point. It's saying I'm done. I'm giving up. All right, that's what we're hearing.
No, it's treating you with a modicum of respect by coming to the table with the
Yeah.
best offer. By giving you the best offer as quickly as reasonably possible I can give you.
Really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
You really think that the way that people bargain these contracts is by exchanging 20 and 30 proposals on stipends of incremental amounts?
That's what we've done on every other article. We've gone back and
Because
forth
it's
dozens and dozens of
language.
times.
Because it's language.
And this is language, pen is language as well. It just also has to do with finances, which also has the connection with the other articles. Most of them have some financial component to them.
I mean, so what you're basically saying is the approach that you think we should take is you come and ask for 125% raise, and we should come to the table and ask for an 85% pay cut, and then we can meet somewhere in the middle. I mean, that's really the logic that you want to employ?
It's not what I said in the slightest.
I mean, but I mean, if you want to talk about where we started versus where we are now.
Address something from earlier. During the points that you were reading out, you said that this was like the biggest increase. Isn't this a $1,400 increase to the minimum for a 9-month employee, and the last one was 2,200? We went from 17,000 to 19,200. And this time we went from 19,200 to your proposal of 20,600. That's 2,200 versus
The
1,400.
raise part.
Just the merit raises.
Yes.
Which won't affect incoming students. Who will come in, right? Who will come in on $20,600?
Right.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. I don't have any.
I think that's a point to clarify. Yeah.
Do you, I mean, we can try, but, okay. See you all next week.
All right.
Have a happy holiday.
All right.